It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling, a low, gut-deep vibration that rattled the coffee mug on my nightstand and hummed up through the floorboards. I've slept through thunderstorms, earthquakes, and the occasional artillery drill back in my younger days. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was an invasion. I swung my legs out of bed, my knees cracking a protest. 5:30 in the morning. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, not yet ready to commit to being day. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and damp, freshly turned earth. A smell that doesn't belong on a quiet hillside at dawn. I pulled on a pair of old jeans and went to the porch. And there it was. A monster of yellow steel, a bulldozer, was chewing up the slope just past my property line. It clawed at the ground, leaving a raw, muddy scar where serene woods had been just yesterday. Standing beside a black SUV, watching the destruction with folded arms, were two figures. One was Brenda, our homeowners association treasurer, a woman who wore her power like a cheap perfume. You could smell the entitlement from 20 feet away. The other was a man I didn't know. He was all teeth in a $1,000 suit that looked ridiculous in the mud. He had the slick, predatory smile of a man who enjoys breaking things. I didn't bother with shoes. The cold, wet grass shocked my bare feet as I walked toward them. The bulldozer operator saw me coming, and, with a hiss of hydraulics, killed the engine. The sudden silence was louder than the noise. "Morning, Mark," Brenda said, her voice dripping with fake pleasantry. She held up a single crisp sheet of paper. "A bit of an early start for you." I ignored her and stared at the churned-up land. "What is this, Brenda? You need a permit from the county to do this kind of grading, especially on a slope like this." The man in the suit stepped forward, his smile widening. "All in good time. We're just doing a little preliminary clearing for a very exciting new development." "A development you failed to mention at the last meeting," I said, my voice flat. "I've learned that with people like this, anger is a luxury. You show them a nerve, and they'll press on it until you scream." Brenda's smile tightened. She thrust the paper at me. "Actually, we're here about you. This is a fine. $2,000. I took the paper. My eyes scanned the jargon, the endless paragraphs of bylaws, until they landed on the reason. Violation 17B. Failure to maintain a structurally sound retaining wall. I looked up from the paper, first at her, then at the low stone wall that lined my property. A wall that had stood there for 50 years, solid as the bedrock it was built on. A wall my father and I had reinforced ourselves 20 years ago. "You're kidding me," I said. It wasn't a question. Have you ever been in a situation so absurd, you feel like you've walked onto a movie set? Like someone's going to yell cut and everyone will start laughing? That's where I was. But nobody was laughing. This is the kind of story you hear about, isn't it? If you're watching Karenology, you probably know the script. It's never just about the wall or the lawn or the color of your front door. It's about control. "The wall is a hazard to the upcoming construction," Brenda stated, as if reading from a script. "It has to be brought up to code, or removed, at your expense, of course." I crumpled the notice in my fist. The paper was still warm from her hand. On my porch, sitting on the railing where I'd left it yesterday, was my old geological hammer, a worn wooden handle, a steel head chipped from 1,000 samples. It was my father's. It had a knack for finding the truth in a pile of rocks. I had a feeling I was going to need it. If a story like this gets under your skin, if you've ever felt that slow burn of injustice, go ahead and hit that like button. You'll want to see how this ends. I looked from Brenda's smug face to the developer's cold eyes. I knew this wasn't about a wall. This was a shakedown. This was the first move in a game I didn't even know I was playing. They wanted me to be scared. They wanted me to roll over. The developer, Vince, must have read my mind. He took another step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear it over the whisper of the wind. His smile never wavered. "Look, Mark," he said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Progress sometimes requires small sacrifices. Just make sure your little stone wall isn't one of them." His words hung in the cold morning air, slick and poisonous. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it as a fact, like telling me the sun was going to rise. I looked at the crumpled paper in my hand, then back at my father's wall. It was more than a wall. It was a line between my world and theirs, and they had just crossed it. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a response. I just turned and walked back to my house, the wet blades of grass sticking to the soles of my feet. The roar of the bulldozer starting up again was like a punch in the back. They weren't waiting. They were confident. Let me tell you something about fighting bullies. Your first instinct is to find a bigger bully to back you up. In our world, that's supposed to be the law. So, that's where I went. I spent the next 2 hours on the phone, found a lawyer who specialized in property disputes, and by noon, I was sitting in his stuffy office that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I laid it all out for him, the lack of county permits, the work on a protected slope, the sudden, retaliatory fine. I even had drone footage from a few weeks prior, a peaceful panoramic of the hillside I'd taken for a personal project. It clearly showed the undisturbed terrain, proof that their work was new and destructive. It felt solid. It felt like a winning hand. My lawyer, a tired man named Peterson, agreed. We filed for an emergency injunction, a court order to stop the work until the permits and the fine could be properly reviewed. The hearing was scheduled for the next day. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that the system, slow and creaky as it was, would work. Have you ever put your faith in something only to watch it crumble into dust right in front of you? The courtroom was cold and impersonal. The judge looked at us over the top of his reading glasses with an expression of profound boredom. Vince and Brenda were there, looking calm and collected. Their lawyer, a shark in an even more expensive suit than Vince's, presented a single document to the judge. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the Homeowners Association Board approved an emergency zoning variance 2 days ago, citing potential soil instability. All work being done is under their authority, as outlined in the covenants." My lawyer shot to his feet. "That's a procedural trick, Your Honor. The instability was created by their own client's illegal grading." The judge just sighed. He glanced at my drone footage on a tablet, then pushed it away. "This footage is inadmissible. It was produced by the plaintiff, it's biased, and lacks professional foundation." He looked at me. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Pity maybe? But it was gone in an instant. The court cannot interfere with the internal governance of a homeowners association unless there's a clear violation of state law. Based on this variance, there isn't one. Injunction denied. The gavel fell. It was a small sound, a dry little crack, but it felt like a door slamming shut in my face. It was over in less than 10 minutes. Vince caught my eye as they were leaving. He didn't smile this time. He just gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod that said, "I told you so." The fine was now $2,000. The lawyer's bill for the failed injunction was another $1,200. I was $3,000 in the hole, and the only thing I had to show for it was the bitter taste of defeat. I drove home in a haze, the world outside my windshield looking gray and washed out. As I turned onto my road, I heard it, that low, grinding roar. It was back, louder. The scar on the hillside was wider, angrier. My failed legal challenge hadn't just been a waste of time and money. It had been a green light. That's when I really understood. The law wasn't my shield. It was just another weapon in their arsenal, and theirs was bigger, sharper, and they knew exactly where to stick it. That low, grinding roar became the soundtrack to my life. It was the first thing I heard in the morning and the last thing I heard before the sun went down, a constant metallic reminder of my own powerlessness. I knew I couldn't stop them with force, and the law had already turned its back on me. So what do you do? What would you do when you're cornered and the enemy has all the big guns? You go back to what you know. For me, that's rocks, earth, the slow, undeniable truth of geology. I spent the next 2 days walking my property line, taking soil samples, checking the moisture content. My father had taught me how to read the land, how to see the story it tells. And this land was telling me a story of instability. The clay soil was already oversaturated from the autumn rains. The new grading was channeling even more water toward the steepest part of the slope, right above my house. It wasn't a matter of if it would slide, but when. Just as I finished logging my data, an email popped up on my phone. An emergency community briefing from the Homeowners Association that night at the community hall. The subject line was "A bright future for our neighborhood." I knew right away it wasn't a briefing. It was a public execution, and I was the guest of honor. The community hall basement smelled of damp concrete and years of potluck dinners. Most of the neighborhood was there, crammed onto folding metal chairs. At the front, Brenda stood next to a projector screen, beaming like she was about to announce a winning lottery number. Vince was there too, leaning against the wall, looking relaxed and magnanimous. He took the floor, and let me tell you, the man could sell ice to a polar bear. He clicked through a presentation of slick, computer-generated images. The summit at Cedar Ridge, he called it. Glassy homes, a community pool, manicured lawns. He talked about progress, about investment, about how this project would raise property values for every single person in the room. He was painting a beautiful picture, and you could see people's eyes light up with dollar signs. Then he got to the main event. He sighed, putting on a show of regret. "Now we've had a minor, unfortunate delay," he said, not looking at me, but making sure everyone else did. "One resident has raised some, let's call them unconventional safety concerns." He let that hang in the air. Unconventional. He made me sound like a crank, a crackpot. Brenda stepped forward. "Our association's priority is always safety," she said, her voice full of false sincerity. "Which is why we've had to address a dangerously dilapidated wall on the border of the new development." That was my cue. I stood up. My voice was steady, louder than I expected. "The wall isn't the problem," I said, and the room went quiet. "The problem is that you are excavating on a conditionally stable slope without proper drainage or geological surveys. You're putting the homes at the bottom of this hill, including mine, at risk of a landslide." I tried to explain the science. I talked about soil mechanics, hydrostatic pressure, the angle of repose. I might as well have been speaking another language. I could see their faces, blank, impatient, annoyed. Then, a voice from the back, a neighbor I'd known for 10 years. "Oh, sit down, Mark. Stop being so dramatic. My real estate agent said this could add $60,000 to my home's value." The dam broke. A wave of murmurs washed over the room. Greed is a powerful current. It sweeps away logic, friendship, common sense. They weren't my neighbors anymore. They were a mob. Brenda seized the moment. "All those in favor of fully supporting the Summit at Cedar Ridge project, please raise your hands." A forest of hands shot up, eager, defiant. I saw maybe 3 other people keep their hands down, staring at their laps. The rest of the room was a united front against me. Vince caught my eye and gave me a little shrug, a gesture that said, "See? The people have spoken." It's a lonely feeling, being the only person in a room telling a truth nobody wants to hear. I walked out of that hall without another word. The happy chatter of my neighbors, already spending their imaginary profits, faded behind me. The cool night air felt good on my face. I stood there for a moment under a weak street lamp, utterly and completely alone. The sound of their voices was gone, replaced by the distant, unending hum of the machines on the hill. The distant, unending hum of the machines was my new reality. I had no allies. The law was a dead end. The community had turned on me. Most men would have given up, packed their bags, sold the house for whatever they could get, and walked away. Maybe I should have. But my father's house wasn't just wood and stone. It was memories. It was roots. And I'm not the kind of man who lets bullies tear up his roots. I was in my garage the next day cleaning my tools, trying to clear my head, when I heard a hesitant knock on the side door. I opened it to find Kevin, the young insurance agent who'd sold me my homeowner's policy a few years back. He was a kid, maybe 28, with glasses that were always slightly crooked and a perpetually worried expression. "Mark," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Got a minute? This is off the record." I let him in. He wouldn't meet my eye. He just stared at a crack in the concrete floor. "I saw what happened at the meeting last night," he mumbled. "It wasn't right." He finally looked up. "Listen, I probably shouldn't be telling you this. I could lose my job, but something's weird about this whole deal." I leaned against my workbench. "I'm listening." Vince, the developer, his company filed a new liability policy for the construction project, standard procedure. But I was curious, so I looked it up. He pulled out his phone, his thumb swiping nervously across the screen. The underwriter, it's a company I've never heard of. Apex Indemnity Group, based in the Cayman Islands. Funny thing about a lifetime of work. You pick things up. I'm a geologist, but you can't work on major projects without learning a thing or two about insurance and liability. "An offshore insurer," I said, "for a high-risk domestic construction project? That's odd." It's more than odd, Kevin whispered, his eyes wide. It's insane. No reputable bank would finance a project like this on the back of a policy from some shell company in a tax haven. Unless they didn't know, I finished for him. He nodded, relieved that I got it. Exactly, and get this. I made a few calls, Apex Indemnity. They don't insure anyone else. This is their only active policy. He left as quietly as he came, leaving me with this strange new piece of the puzzle. It didn't make sense, but it was something, a thread. And right now, a thread was all I had. I needed more. I needed to know who Vince really was. Here's the thing about living in a small town. Everybody knows somebody. I made a call to Arthur, the old town librarian. He's been there 40 years, a walking encyclopedia of local history, grudges, and backroom deals. He's a bit of a grump, but he hates corporate bullies more than he hates noise in his library. Vince, you say? He grumbled over the phone. The slick fella in the suit? Yeah, I know the type. Give me an hour. An hour later, my printer was spitting out corporate registration documents. Vince's company, Cedar Ridge Holdings, LLC, was a tangled web of shell corporations. But Arthur, bless his crusty, cynical heart, had found the main thread. The parent company. A holding firm registered to the exact same P.O. box in the Cayman Islands as Apex Indemnity Group. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. Vince wasn't just using an obscure insurer, he was insuring himself. It was a phantom policy. A piece of paper designed to look real enough to fool the bank that was bankrolling his whole operation, but worthless in the event of a real disaster. He wasn't just cutting corners. This was fraud, on a massive scale. He wasn't planning for an accident. He was expecting one. He'd take the bank's money, build his shoddy houses, sell them to unsuspecting buyers, and by the time the whole hillside came crashing down, he and his money would be long gone, protected by a maze of shell corporations, and an insurance policy that was nothing but smoke. My fight wasn't just about my wall anymore. It was about stopping a catastrophe he was actively engineering. But what could I do with this information? What I had was a stack of papers, a conspiracy theory. And I had a sinking feeling that if I wasn't careful, that paper trail would lead directly to my own ruin. That paper trail was a bomb, and I was holding it. The problem with a bomb is that if you don't know how to use it, it's more likely to blow up in your own face. I had proof of fraud, but it was complex, circumstantial. It was the kind of thing lawyers argue about for years. I needed something simple, something undeniable, something physical. So I went back to the earth. I spent the entire next day on my hands and knees along the property line, sinking a dozen narrow boreholes with a hand auger. I was taking core samples, logging the soil strata, measuring the moisture content. The results were worse than I thought. The excavation had completely altered the water table. A layer of impermeable clay, which had once kept the hillside stable, was now acting like a slip and slide, lubricated by a growing pocket of trapped groundwater. The whole slope was a ticking time bomb. I worked until my back screamed and my hands were raw. I documented everything: photos, measurements, GPS coordinates. I compiled it all into a formal geological report. It wasn't the rambling of a crank anymore. It was hard science, undeniable data. This, I thought, this they can't ignore. I sent the report to the county supervisor's office, certified mail. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It was done. The ball was in their court now. They had a legal and ethical obligation to investigate. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Not a villain, but someone you thought was on your side? It's a different kind of wound. It cuts deeper. That night, the rain started. A cold, steady autumn downpour that drummed against the roof and turned the world outside into a gray soup. Around midnight, I was woken by a crash from the back of the house. Not the low rumble of machinery, but a sharp splintering sound. I grabbed a heavy maglite from the nightstand and went to investigate. The door to my detached workshop, my sanctuary, was hanging crooked on its hinges, the lock shattered. Inside, it was a scene of total violation. My workbench was overturned. My carefully collected soil samples were dumped on the floor, mixed into a muddy, useless slurry. My hand auger was bent into a pretzel. My laptop, with all my data and the draft of my report, was gone. They hadn't just destroyed my evidence. They had trespassed. They had robbed me. They had invaded my space. A cold, hard rage settled in my chest. This was no longer about bylaws and property lines. This was personal. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, as I was standing amidst the wreckage, a county inspector's truck pulled up. A man I'd never seen before, with a clipboard and a sour expression, got out. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at the broken door. He walked straight to my retaining wall. He ran a hand along a fresh crack, a crack that hadn't been there 2 days ago. It was a clean, sharp fracture, the kind of damage that doesn't happen naturally. He made a few notes, then handed me an official-looking form. "Emergency abatement order," he said, his voice flat and bored. "This wall is a critical failure. You have 24 hours to have it demolished at your own expense. If you don't, the county will do it and bill you. Total cost, around $30,000. My report. The break-in, the new crack, the instant arrival of an inspector. It all connected. Vince didn't just have Brenda in his pocket. He had someone at the county too. My own report, my formal cry for help, had been used as a weapon against me. They'd use my warning to trigger the very inspection that would ruin me. $30,000. It might as well have been $1 million. After the hit my small business took from the bad press, I was barely keeping my head above water. This would sink me. They had me. They had won. I stood there in the rain, the demolition order turning to mush in my hand, and felt something break inside me. It wasn't just the wall that was failing. It was my will to fight. That order was a death sentence. I stood in the doorway of my wrecked workshop, the smell of rain and ruin hanging in the air, and for the first time in this whole mess, I felt the fight drain out of me. They hadn't just beaten me, they'd humiliated me. They'd turned my own expertise, my own diligence, into the instrument of my destruction. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions. I called demolition companies. The quotes were, as expected, astronomical. I called my insurance company. They politely informed me that my policy didn't cover pre-existing structural failures or damage resulting from government orders. Kevin, the young agent, called me back, his voice full of genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mark. My hands are tied." Defeated, I sank into the old armchair in my living room. The house was quiet except for the relentless drumming of the rain. I stared at the papers on my coffee table, the fraudulent insurance documents, the web of shell corporations. A paper bomb. It was useless, proof of a crime I couldn't get anyone to care about. And that's when it hit me. I'd been trying to get the government to care, the county, the courts. But what if they weren't the right audience? What if the person who needed to see this wasn't a judge or a supervisor, but someone who had even more to lose than I did? My father had a saying, "If you want to know where the power is, follow the money." I had been following Vince's money, his fraudulent schemes, but I'd been ignoring the other side of the equation, the source, the bank. The bank was lending Vince millions of dollars based on a lie I held in my hands. The bank didn't care about my wall or the slope or the bylaws, but they cared deeply and passionately about their money. They cared about risk, and Vince, I realized, was the biggest risk of all. A new energy surged through me. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something colder, sharper. It was the clarity that comes when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. My plan started to form, not as a complex legal strategy, but as a simple, direct action. I wasn't going to write another report. I wasn't going to file another motion. I was going to talk to the money. I spent the next few hours online. It wasn't hard to find out who was financing the summit at Cedar Ridge. Big projects like that, they like to boast. I found press releases, news articles. The lead lender was a major regional bank, Sterling National, and I found something else. The date and time for their next big public event. A groundbreaking ceremony, a photo op, this Thursday, 2 days from now. My phone rang. It was Arthur, the librarian. His voice was a low grumble. "Mark, that developer, Vince, something he's been doing, it reminded me of an old story. A guy back in the 80s tried to pull a similar stunt with a condo development. Insurance fraud, shell companies, the whole 9 yards. What happened to him?" I asked. "Nothing," Arthur said, and I could hear the disgust in his voice. "The project went bust. He declared bankruptcy and walked away clean. Left 100 families with worthless properties. But here's the thing I remembered, the one thing that almost got him. It wasn't the fraud. It was a clause in his loan agreement, a tiny little sentence, something about misrepresentation. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. It wasn't just about the fake insurance. It was about the contract. It was about the bank's own rules. I knew what I had to do. It was a wild, desperate gamble. It would either save me or get me arrested for trespassing. There was no in-between. I took a deep breath. The rain was still coming down, but for the first time in days, I didn't hear the roar of the bulldozer. I heard the slow, steady tick of a clock. 2 days. The demolition order was still on my door, a ticking time bomb. But now, I had one of my own. The day of the groundbreaking ceremony arrived with a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The rain hadn't stopped. It had settled into a miserable, persistent drizzle that clung to everything. They had set up a large white tent on the flattest part of the graded land, a pathetic island of formality in a sea of mud. Underneath it, a small crowd of suits huddled together, sipping coffee from paper cups. Vince was at the center of it all, shaking hands, his face a mask of triumphant charm. I wasn't dressed for a party. I wore my old work boots, jeans, and a worn-out jacket. I hadn't come to celebrate. I had come to end it. In my inner pocket, I had a single waterproof folder containing 3 documents: the registration for Vince's holding company, the registration for his phantom insurance firm showing the same address, and a highlighted copy of the bank's own press release boasting about their rigorous due diligence. I didn't storm the tent. I didn't cause a scene. I just waited. I stood just outside the circle of warmth and light, letting the cold rain soak into my jacket. I watched as the speeches began. Brenda took the podium first, gushing about community and progress. Then Vince, his voice booming with false confidence, painted his vision of luxury and profit. Finally, a portly man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped up. His name badge read, Daniel Porter, Senior Vice President, Sterling National Bank. He was the money. He was my target. As he began to speak about the bank's commitment to smart, sustainable growth, I started walking. I moved slowly, deliberately, not toward the podium, but directly toward him. A couple of security guards shifted, their eyes on me, but I kept my hands visible, my pace unthreatening. I stopped about 10 feet from him. He faltered in his speech, annoyed at the interruption. The crowd murmured. Vince shot me a look of pure venom. Mr. Porter, I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry under the tent. My name is Mark. I own the property just down the hill. I have a question for you. He tried to wave me off. Sir, this isn't the time or the place. I believe it is, I cut in, taking another step. I was just wondering if Sterling National Bank is aware that the collateral insurance policy for this entire multi-million-dollar project is fraudulent. A shocked silence fell over the tent. The only sound was the drumming of rain on the vinyl roof. Porter's face went from pink to white. That's a baseless and slanderous accusation, Vince shouted, rushing toward me. I ignored him. My eyes were locked on Porter. Are you aware, I continued, my voice like ice, that the insurer, Apex Indemnity, is a shell company owned and operated by Mr. Vince himself? That he is, in effect, insuring his own project with a policy that is functionally worthless? I pulled the folder from my jacket. And are you aware that by starting construction before the policy was even signed, he has violated Section 11.4 of your own standard commercial loan agreement, rendering the entire contract null and void due to material misrepresentation? I didn't hand the papers to him. I just held them out. He stared at them like they were a snake. The truth was no longer a complicated paper trail. It was a simple, brutal equation. Bad insurance, plural, broken contract, yobo, massive, unsecured risk. It was a language he understood perfectly. Porter looked from the papers in my hand to Vince's panicked face, and in that instant, he knew. He knew I was telling the truth. The photo op was over. The party was over. He turned, grabbed his briefcase, and walked to his car without another word. The other bankers followed him like pilot fish after a shark. Vince stood frozen, his perfect smile finally gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief and fury. The crowd of suits began to melt away, whispering into their phones. Within 5 minutes, the tent was empty except for me, Vince, and a very confused Brenda. He finally turned to me. You, he hissed. You've ruined everything. No, I said, dropping the now useless folder into a puddle of mud. You did. You just didn't think anyone would be watching. The aftermath was swift. The bank froze all funding. The project collapsed overnight. Vince disappeared, leaving a mountain of debt and a string of lawsuits behind him. Brenda was voted out of the Homeowners Association in a landslide of angry neighbors who had seen their promised profits evaporate. The county quietly rescinded my demolition order. A few weeks later, the land was put up for auction, a toxic asset nobody wanted. I thought about buying it, securing my little patch of earth for good, but I didn't. Instead, I used my savings, what little I had left, to help form a community land trust with the few neighbors who had stood by me. We bought the land, not for houses, not for profit. We planted trees. We're turning that muddy scar back into a forest, a small public park for everyone. It cost me. It cost me financially, it cost me friendships, it cost me my faith in a lot of things. But standing on my porch now, I don't hear the roar of bulldozers. I hear the wind in the young trees. On the railing, my father's old geological hammer sits catching the afternoon sun. Sometimes, the only way to win a fight isn't to build a bigger wall, but to remind everyone what the ground beneath their feet is really worth. If you've ever had to fight for what's right, even when you were standing alone, let me know your story in the comments. It's good to know you're not the only one.